The last few years have seen a surge in climate protests, from Greenpeace activists chaining themselves to oil rigs, to students boycotting gas-guzzling vehicles. Environmental activism's become a powerful force. But what if some of these seemingly noble protests were actually orchestrated by the very industry they're fighting against? Let's trace the evolution of environmental activism, from tree huggers to global movements, and see how big oil's historically countered their cries for change. This isn't just about conspiracy theories and finger-pointing, because the plot thickens with allegations of covert funding and strategic manipulation. Can good intentions be hijacked for corporate gain? How can we really differentiate genuine activism from orchestrated distractions? We'll expose the tactics, analyze the evidence, and leave you with the tools to separate greenwashing from genuine grassroots movements. In recent years, climate action movements have catapulted the issue of climate change into the global spotlight. Their demand's been simple: that the government agree to a moratorium on all new oil and gas projects, in line with a recommendation by the International Energy Agency. Activist groups like Extinction Rebellion and Fridays for Future have led the charge in advocating for ambitious climate action. While they've successfully captured the attention of the media, do such protests actually increase public support for climate action? From Turkey and Germany to the US, Australia, and countries across Africa, local activists have fought against corporate actions that threaten to destroy precious green spaces and accelerate global warming. However, things can get a little messy when these actions have unintended consequences. And now, to understand unintended consequences, we must look into the history of environmental protests. A history of environmental activism, its goals and methods. Before we get into the history of environmental activism, let's first understand what it really is. Environmental protests are demonstrations seeking to bring recognition of how people, companies, or governments impact a natural environment. Protests are staged to bring attention to environmental issues and to prompt action to prevent or address environmental problems. Most environmental protests are planned and peaceful. However, a small minority of protests employ controversial tactics with the potential to harm people or property. Sometimes they help, and sometimes they don't. But when do things get messy? When things get messy. The sun glints off the steel of a pipeline onto the determined faces of chained activists. Their voices reverberate with chants of "No more oil" and "Protect the planet." Everybody's in the spirit of environmental activism, a passionate fight for a future powered by renewables and free from the shackles of fossil fuels. Yet beneath the surface of this noble pursuit lies a chilling possibility: that some environmental protests, even those funded by the very industry they oppose, might unwittingly fuel the fire of big oil. The paradox of greenwash protests, when saving the planet fuels big oil. This takes us to the 90s Pacific Northwest, where the Save the Owl campaign, fueled by groups like Earth First and Greenpeace, aimed to protect the endangered northern spotted owl. Their efforts succeeded in securing endangered species protection, but with unintended consequences. As logging and owl habitat became restricted, timber pieces skyrocketed, benefiting alternative sources like big oil's vast timber holdings. The intended environmental protection inadvertently propped up the very industry responsible for fossil fuel dependence. This phenomenon, known as perverse incentives, shows us the potential pitfalls of even well-intentioned activism. As the recent article says, it was terrifying. Stop Oil activists on the new battle against fossil fuel, which notes, even seemingly targeted protests, like Stop Oil's action against Van Gogh's sunflowers, can inadvertently shift focus and alienate potential supporters. Shifting the focus, not the system. Some argue that certain protests, while targeting specific environmental issues, might distract from the bigger picture, transitioning away from fossil fuels altogether. For example, focusing solely on biofuels, while seemingly cleaner, can perpetuate reliance on existing infrastructure and delay the shift towards truly sustainable energy sources. This can be seen as a strategic move by oil companies to maintain their dominance while appearing environmentally conscious. Allegations have emerged that some oil companies fund green initiatives and environmental groups with hidden agendas. These strings attached can steer the focus towards solutions that benefit the industry, such as carbon capture and storage technologies, while neglecting systemic change and the development of truly renewable energy sources. This ultimately raises concerns about greenwashing, where environmental initiatives serve as a PR facade for continued fossil fuel dependence. A history of environmental battles. From the early days of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring to global movements like Greenpeace and the anti-nuclear movement, environmental activism's evolved significantly. The focus has shifted from localized concerns to systemic change, with goals encompassing endangered species protection, climate change mitigation, and sustainable practices. Methods have diversified from direct action and protests to lobbying, legal challenges, and public education campaigns. While these efforts have achieved victories like the Montreal Protocol phasing out CFCs, they've also faced fierce opposition from entrenched industries. As journalist Naomi Klein argues in This Changes Everything: Capitalism versus the Climate, powerful corporations often manipulate regulations and narratives to maintain their dominance, making victories all the more significant. Big Oil's response, from denial to strategic engagement. Initially, the fossil fuel industry responded to environmental concerns with outright denial of climate change. However, as scientific evidence mounted and public awareness grew, this tactic became untenable. Big Oil, as detailed in the New York Times article, "These groups want disruptive climate protests, oil heirs are funding them," adopted a more sophisticated approach. They poured resources into PR campaigns promoting environmental responsibility and clean energy, often funding green initiatives and environmental groups with strings attached. This greenwashing, as exposed by Greenpeace in their report "Fossil Fuel Firms Spent Millions on U.S. Lawmakers Who Sponsored Anti-Protest Bills," aimed to deflect attention from fossil fuels and towards alternative energy sources that wouldn't threaten their core business. The hidden world of funding. Allegations of Big Oil funding environmental groups have been around for decades. As early as the 1980s, ExxonMobil was reportedly linked to groups opposing nuclear power, potentially to favor their own interests in oil and gas. More recently, investigative reports like Just Stop Oil's Spring Uprising protests funded by U.S. philanthropists have revealed connections between major oil companies and environmental organizations advocating for biofuels. These alternative fuels, while seemingly cleaner, can have their own environmental drawbacks and still perpetuate dependence on fossil fuel infrastructure. As environmental journalist Tim DeChristoffer argues in Flickering Flame, A Story of Gaslight and Resistance, discerning genuine environmentalism from industry-backed initiatives requires careful scrutiny of funding sources, advocacy focus, and potential unintended consequences. As long as Big Oil's tactics remain either open or hidden, the Just Stop Oil tactics and disruptions will prevail and come to light in the public eye. From disruption to actual disaster. The group Just Stop Oil's also set its sights on some big sports events, like Wimbledon Tennis Championships, the second Ashes Test at Lord's Cricket Ground, and the World Snooker Championship in Sheffield. The disruptions extend beyond sports, impacting cultural events as well. A performance of the musical Les Miserables in London and a BBC Proms concert at the Royal Albert Hall have also fallen victim to these incidents. In an unusual turn of events in October of 2022, two supporters of the Just Stop Oil movement expressed their dissent by tossing tomato soup over Vincent van Gogh's iconic painting, Sunflowers, displayed at London's National Gallery, although the painting emerged unscathed. The following November saw activists from the same group targeting another masterpiece in the National Gallery. Using safety hammers, they shattered the protective glass surrounding Diego Velázquez's Rokeby Venus, a work that had seen previous turmoil when suffragette Mary Richardson slashed it in 1914. How Just Stop Oil hurts everyone but Big Oil. While Just Stop Oil may claim noble intentions, their tactics of disruption and vandalism have left a trail of chaos and inconvenience for regular people. Their focus on flamboyant and often counterproductive actions only serves to alienate the very public they need to win over. Instead of targeting the true culprits, the wealthy elite and corporate giants profiting from fossil fuels, they choose to disrupt the lives of everyday people struggling to get by. Let's talk about the real casualties here. Imagine rushing to the hospital with a loved one, only to get stuck in a gridlock caused by protesters glued to the asphalt. Think about missing a crucial job interview or failing to pick up your child from daycare because some self-proclaimed environmental martyr decided to shut down a bridge. These are the consequences faced by ordinary citizens, caught in the crossfire of Just Stop Oil's misguided activism. Now, think about the art we talked about, the tomato soup attack on Van Gogh's Sunflowers, and the defacing of Velázquez's masterpiece. While climate change undoubtedly poses a threat to our cultural heritage, These reckless acts of vandalism do nothing to address the root of the problem. They only alienate art lovers and damage priceless artifacts, leaving a bitter taste in the mouths of those who appreciate beauty and history. The awful audacity of storming a Formula One race, endangering drivers and jeopardizing the livelihoods of countless crew members simply for a fleeting moment of notoriety. This stunt does nothing to curb fossil fuel dependency. It just alienates sports fans and reinforces the negative image of environmentalism as a movement of reckless attention seekers. It's surely costing millions and saving nothing. Let's talk about the hefty price tag of Just Stop Oil's disruptions. Millions of taxpayer pounds wasted on policing protests, clearing roads, and repairing vandalized property. This money, desperately needed for public services and infrastructure, is now diverted to clean up the mess left by their antics. And who suffers the consequences? You guessed it, the very same people they claim to champion, ignoring the real culprits. While Just Stop Oil glues themselves to roads and hurls soup at paintings, the real polluters, the wealthy elite and corporate giants, continue to operate with impunity. Their opulent lifestyles fueled by fossil fuels remain untouched, while the burden of disruption falls on the shoulders of ordinary citizens. Is this truly effective activism, or is it a self-indulgent performance, alienating the very people they need to convince and leaving the real villains unscathed? It's time for Just Stop Oil to take a hard look at their tactics and realize that the true environmentalism requires strategic action, not self-serving spectacles. Until then, their protests will remain nothing more than a costly inconvenience, leaving a bitter taste in the mouths of those who genuinely care about protecting the planet. The rise of individuals like John Kerry and Greta Thunberg being called climate experts raises concerns. Saving the planet feels like a lost dream, with only a glimmer of hope amid suspicions of hidden agendas and profit motives for big companies. Untangling the web, separating genuine green from manufactured activism. So, how can we discern genuine environmental activism from those potentially benefiting big oil? Transparency is the first pillar of discernment. Groups with open funding sources and clear, independent decision-making processes are less likely to be compromised. Another red flag is advocacy focused solely on specific solutions that benefit certain industries over comprehensive systemic change. Finally, scrutinizing the actual impact of any proposed solution, considering its long-term implications for environmental sustainability and resource use, is also very important. Ask yourself, does this solution truly change the fossil fuel industry's dominance, or does it simply offer a band-aid while perpetuating the status quo? As the Stop Oil activists emphasize in the Guardian article, evaluating both tactics and goals is essential. Discerning the authenticity of environmental activism requires critical thinking and vigilance, but it's important to make sure that our efforts truly serve the planet, not corporate agendas disguised in green clothing. The road ahead and hope in the midst of paradox. The truth will set you free, but first it will piss you off. Gloria Steinem. The path towards a sustainable future is undoubtedly challenging, riddled with paradoxes and the ever-present threat of greenwashing. Yet, amidst all these difficulties, there are reasons for hope. The increasing public awareness of climate change, the rise of youth-led movements, and the growing commitment to renewable energy by some corporations show that the tide is turning. The fight for a clean future is far from over, but with critical thinking, some real dedication, and collective action, we can overcome the paradoxes and create the way for a sustainable tomorrow. Will you join the movement? One person can make a difference, and every person should try. John F. Kennedy.